Hi, welcome to US History, but Interesting, the series where we go through American history connecting with the past by Allan Brinkley chapter by chapter and talk about what the textbook says, what it doesn't say, and why you should care about this history right now in the 21st century. Today, we're talking about Chapter 12, Antebellum Culture and Reform, and this time around, we're going to divide the chapter into two separate videos. This first one is going to cover all the cultural stuff from between 1820 and 1860, plus a couple of reform movements. The second part will talk specifically about abolitionism and feminism. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Okay, so at a high level, there are four major themes we're going to talk about here. Those four themes are as follows. Number one, American culture was heavily influenced by the Romantic movement that was going on in Europe at this time. By the end of the period, many American artists would contribute to that movement themselves. Number two, America was also developing its own unique cultural and intellectual identity that was separate from that of Europe. Number three, Americans were looking for ways to fundamentally transform their world to create a more perfect society. And number four, Americans were also looking for ways to protect and reinforce existing parts of their culture that they were worried might get swept away by all of the political, social, and economic changes that we've been talking about for the last couple of chapters. And if some of those things seem like they directly contradict each other, yeah, that's part of why it's hard to talk about an entire culture all at the same time. Whenever the next Marvel movie comes out and your YouTube recommendations are flooded with fans gushing about how great it was and also video essays ranting about how Disney has destroyed the soul of the film industry for the 9th time this year, you'll get a taste of some of these contradictions in our own time as well. In any case, the first big idea we have to talk about is something called Romanticism. And this is not like, hey, with 3 Ys, quoting Ed Sheeran lyrics, Netflix and chill kind of romance. Just give me a second and I'll explain. So, during this period, the United States was part of a larger cultural sphere that was primarily centered around Britain and France. That meant that whatever big cultural and intellectual movements were sweeping Western Europe would eventually wind up sweeping the US as well. Remember that this is exactly the same thing that happened with the First Great Awakening and the Enlightenment back in the 1700s. However, in this time period, Europe was kind of over the whole Enlightenment thing. From a certain perspective, the French Revolution represented what happened when you carried the Enlightenment to its logical conclusion. By 1815, it was easy, especially if you were either conservative or British, to see the legacy of the French Revolution as nothing more than 25 years of social and political upheaval and millions of meaningless deaths. That's the environment where Romanticism really came to the fore. You see, Romanticism rejected the Enlightenment's focus on things like science and rationality and these intricate mechanical explanations for how every piece of the universe fits together. Instead, Romantics focused on intense human emotion. They valued things like intuition and individual acts of heroism, and they had this wide-eyed sense of wonder at the inexplicable beauty of nature. The easiest place to see this is in paintings like the ones from the Hudson River School that developed in New York at this time. Here are a couple examples from Asher Durand, Frederick Church, and my personal favorite, Thomas Cole. You'll notice that your textbook doesn't actually include any of these pictures. That's because Dr. Brinkley wrote the entire thing the night before it was due, and nobody ever bothered to edit it. Another big manifestation of the Romantic movement in the United States was something called Transcendentalism. That is a big pretentious word for, honestly, a pretty small pretentious movement. Their ideas were influential, though, so they're still worth talking about. You see, Transcendentalists believed that there was a kind of spark inside every single human being that basically allowed them to connect to the very fabric of reality at an intuitive, emotional level. Because of this, Transcendentalists believed that a person's most important allegiance was not to the government or their community or the church, but rather to their own personal conscience. That in turn meant that if the people around you were doing something you didn't agree with, you had a responsibility to refuse to participate. The most famous example of this came in 1846 when the second most famous transcendentalist, Henry David Thoreau, spent time in jail because he refused to pay his taxes as a protest against the ongoing war with Mexico. Thoreau later published an essay called Civil Disobedience that argued for peaceful resistance to immoral government actions. Now, this specific protest wound up not actually mattering. Thoreau's family paid his tax bill and got him out of jail the next day, and the war would keep going for another 2 years. But the idea of civil disobedience will come up again later with activists who aren't complete clown shows, so it's worth tucking away in the back of your mind. Now, a second ago, I said that Thoreau was the second most famous transcendentalist. But who is the most famous? Well, the thing about Transcendentalists is that when you get down to brass tacks, it really feels like there were only about half a dozen of them, and almost all of them lived or worked in Ralph Waldo Emerson's renovated garage/guest bedroom, so if you're looking for the center of the movement, it's gotta be him. Emerson wrote a bunch of essays and speeches and poems, but I want to focus specifically on a lecture that he gave in 1837 called The American Scholar. For me, the most interesting part of this speech is what Emerson says about learning from books. For Emerson, a book is a useful tool, but it's not the be-all, end-all of reality. Just because someone wrote something down, that doesn't make it true. And importantly, just because something was true in the time and place where that book was written, that doesn't mean it's true here and now. As he puts it, quote, "It depends on how far the process has gone, of transmuting life into truth. In proportion to the completeness of the distillation, so will the purity and imperishableness of the product be. But none is quite perfect. Each age, it is found, must write its own books, or rather, each generation for the next succeeding. The books of an older period will not fit this." And look, I've made fun of the Transcendentalists a lot, and I will continue to do so on the grounds that it's fun and they actually were ridiculous people. But Emerson is making an important point here. You can't just copy-paste something from 400 years ago and assume it's going to magically work in a modern context. There's a reason why Shakespeare wrote like 30 some odd plays and we only ever talk about like 5 of them now. This is a big part of why I think history is useful. When you look at a book or a movie or a song or a painting or whatever that's from a different place and a different time, history allows you to understand the context in which that thing was created. Once you understand that context, you can make your own decisions about which parts of that work actually apply to you and your life. The answer is not going to be all of it, but it's probably not going to be none of it either. Emerson ends The American Scholar with a call to action. See, Emerson delivered this speech to a group of Phi Beta Kappa honor students at Harvard. He told his audience that their job as the next generation of American scholars was to create a cultural and intellectual identity for America that was truly unique and distinct from the rest of the world. Now, did Ralph Waldo Emerson personally cause the development of true American culture by making this speech? I mean, were Franklin and Jefferson looking on from the afterlife like, "Dang, man, I wish I'd have thought of that. Good idea, Ralph"? No. I'm sure some people were inspired by this speech, but I think the bigger story here is the way that technological and societal changes in this period made it easier for people like Emerson to develop and spread their ideas. For example, in the late 1820s and into the 30s, many cities, including Emerson's hometown of Concord, Massachusetts, established local clubs called lyceums. These lyceums would host lectures and debates that covered topics all the way from chemistry and agriculture to politics and philosophy. Most of these lectures were given by local community members, but lyceums also routinely invited guest speakers who would often get paid to be there. By the 1840s, the spread of railroads allowed these guest lecturers to travel farther and faster than they ever could before. On top of that, the growing telegraph networks made it easier to spread information. For example, the Associated Press, founded in 1846, used telegraphs to share news stories all over the country. At the same time, a new technology called the rotary printing press made it cheaper and easier to mass-produce newspapers. Add to that the fact that education was getting better and easier to access, and all of a sudden you have a situation where regular people have easy access to news from all over the country. Intellectuals like Emerson can make a living touring lyceums across multiple states, and don't forget that regular people are moving along those rails too, and they're taking their ideas and cultures with them. For centuries, most Americans' lives have been focused on their local communities and their local or regional cultures. But now, everyone could talk to everyone else and move around the country freely. It's a recipe for exactly the sort of coherent national culture that Emerson was talking about. At least, in the places that had railroads and telegraphs and modern schools, which was mostly the North and the East. Much of the rural South and the new states west of the Mississippi weren't really connected to these transportation and communication networks yet, so their cultures remained somewhat disconnected. But what did this new, uniquely American culture look like in practice? Well, this period gave us several of the most famous works of American literature. They were all part of that broader Romantic movement that we've been talking about, but they all also dealt with specifically American subject matter. Moby Dick is about the New England whaling industry, The Scarlet Letter is about colonial Puritan Massachusetts, and Last of the Mohicans is set on the frontier during the French and Indian War. This was not just European literature that happened to be published in the United States. This was honest-to-goodness American literature. However, my personal favorite American author from this period is Edgar Allan Poe, one of the few prominent authors from the South. You may have read some of Poe's short horror stories like The Cask of Amontillado or The Telltale Heart. I also recommend a lesser-known story called The Mask of the Red Death, which is about a bunch of rich idiots throwing a party while everyone is quarantined because of a plague. It just, it resonates a little bit more now than it did 4 years ago for some reason. Poe's most famous work, though, is a poem called The Raven, which you should check out if you're not familiar with. I'll link to a video of Christopher Lee reading it, and also a video of The Simpsons acting it out. The biggest work of poetry from this time, though, was Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, the so-called poet of American democracy. This collection was popular, but it was also controversial because it was overtly sexual, and it included some sections that are probably specifically homosexual and were read as such at the time. If you're curious, Kazaro has a video about the queer history of the Old West that quotes from Leaves of Grass. I'll link to that in the description. Now, no discussion of American culture is complete without talking at least a little bit about religion. We've talked before about the Second Great Awakening, that period of Christian revivalism around the turn of the century, but now we get to talk about some of the smaller denominations that we previously skipped. The first group was the Shakers, so called because of the ecstatic dancing they did during worship. The Shakers separated themselves from mainstream America so that they could build their version of an ideal society. Their beliefs included such a radical support for racial and gender equality that not only did they have female religious leaders, which was unusual at the time, they also taught that God was neither strictly male nor strictly female. They also believed in complete lifelong celibacy, which meant that nobody was ever born into the faith, and in the long run, most adults weren't really interested in joining them. The movement peaked in the mid-1800s and steadily declined. A more successful religious movement was started in New York State by a man named Joseph Smith. In 1830, Smith published the Book of Mormon, which tells the story of a lost tribe of Israel coming to the Americas and eventually meeting Jesus after his resurrection. Like the Shakers, the Mormons built a religious community that was separate from mainstream society. Unlike the Shakers, the Mormons were not celibate. In fact, early Mormons actually practiced polygamy, with one man marrying multiple women. Because of this, and also because of general 19th century religious bigotry, the Mormons were chased out of New York and eventually wound up in Nauvoo, Illinois. In 1844, Joseph Smith was arrested, and a mob of angry locals broke into the jail and killed him. Following this, a man named Brigham Young became the leader of the largest group of Mormons and led them westward to what is now Salt Lake City. Once again, they established their own ideal society, separate from the problems of the rest of the country. But religious groups were not the only ones separating from society to build their version of utopia. One example was Brook Farm. This one was motivated by Transcendentalist philosophy, so I'll give you 3 guesses who was leading it. Say it with me. George Ripley. What, you thought Ralph Waldo Emerson was going to move into a brand new community in the middle of nowhere? Come on, if he moved, who was going to sit there and listen to Thoreau complain about how commercialism is bad and the solution is living in the woods and planting beans? Brook Farm started in 1841 and would be abandoned by the end of the decade. Americans also created a number of utopian communities that were based on the ideas of European socialists like Robert Owen and Charles Fourier. For example, the Oneida community in upstate New York existed from 1848 until the 1880s, when it became a silverware company of all things. The Amana community, which was founded by German immigrants in the 1840s based on a mix of Christian and socialist ideas, actually still exists according to the EMSCO book. But not everyone with a vision for the future of America wanted to go build society from scratch. As an example, let's talk about education reform. You may remember that the early colonists of New England set up a system of public schools in every town. The problem was that many towns didn't actually bother putting these schools together, and many children only irregularly attended. 19th century reformers wanted to start taking these schools much more seriously. In 1837, Massachusetts appointed Horace Mann to be the secretary of the new State Board of Education. He increased the length of the school year to 6 months and doubled teacher salaries. Reformers like him also introduced new textbooks and new training for teachers. For the first time, the state started tracking things like enrollment, school funding, and student literacy rates to help them figure out what was working and where they needed to allocate more resources. But what's interesting here is not just what the reformers did, but why they did it. See, traditionally, education in Massachusetts was about teaching children to be good, obedient members of Puritan society. But reformers like Mann broadened that scope. In a world of increasing democracy, they wanted kids to have the knowledge and skills to actually participate in that democracy. In a world of rapidly growing industry and ever-expanding capitalist markets, they felt like an education would help kids develop marketable skills. Otherwise, they might become these interchangeable parts that factory owners could slot into place and dump on the street based on the whims of the market. But at the same time that reformers believed all of those forward-looking ideas, they also still believed in that old vision of school as a means of teaching kids the moral values that they thought would lead to a stable society. In 1823, one reformer said that the goal of education was, quote, to fit the scholars to perform justly, skillfully, and magnanimously the duties of every station in life, both public and private, to secure to them the greatest possible happiness, taking in the whole life, to elevate their minds from the degradation of sin to the love of worship and favor of God, and to qualify them for the eternal enjoyments of heaven, end quote. And you better believe that in Massachusetts at this time, when they said favor of God, they meant Protestant God. The EMSCO book points out that while this period did see the rapid expansion of public schools that were free for even the poorest students, it also saw the creation of a bunch of private Catholic schools for parents who had enough money to make sure that their kids weren't getting the wrong flavor of religious indoctrination. In time, education reform spread from Massachusetts to the rest of the country. But like with the early New England schools, many public schools in the South existed more in theory than in reality. The textbook says that by 1860, only about 1/3 of white children in the South were in school, compared to something like 72% in the North. And one final point about these schools. These reformers weren't just interested in providing free education to poor students. They were also interested in reaching types of students that had been traditionally excluded. Oberlin College in Ohio and Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts became two of the first colleges to admit women. At the same time, Samuel Gridley Howe was working to set up schools for the blind, and Thomas Gallaudet was setting up schools for the deaf. From there, we should move on to temperance, a reform movement that promised to free society from the evils of alcohol. Now, it's easy to think of temperance advocates as these stodgy old folks who just wanted to ruin young people's good time. And to be honest, yeah, some of these people do seem like the type to call the police on their neighbors for playing music after 8 p.m. on a Saturday. I mean, don't these hooligans have church in the morning? But it's worth taking a second to understand just how much drinking was actually going on at this time. On average, Americans drank 3 times as much distilled liquor in the early republic as they do now. And that wasn't just confined to the weekends. People were drinking all the time. As historian Robert A. Gross puts it, quote, drinking was a social custom as well as an individual choice. To decline a sociable glass was to break the rules of hospitality. To refuse grog to laborers was to violate the accepted terms of employment. To shun the tavern was to cut oneself off from a vital hub of community and news. Alcohol was omnipresent in the workplace. Convinced that intense physical effort could not be sustained without the aid of spirit, farmers supplied rum to their men in the fields. Twice daily at 10 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, work would stop for grog and toddy, in a rural version of the modern coffee break. End quote. And all this drinking had real consequences. People, in particular young men, were dying. And alcohol abuse by men often had damaging knock-on effects for their families. If you were a woman and your husband died or simply decided to blow all of his money on gin, it would be incredibly difficult for you to earn enough money to provide for yourself and your children. There weren't a lot of jobs for women at this time, and the ones that did exist did not pay well. On top of that, there really weren't serious domestic violence laws, so if your husband happened to be an angry drunk, and he chose to take that out on you and your kids, there wasn't much you could do about that either. With that in mind, it probably shouldn't surprise you that 2 of the major groups that supported temperance were the people most directly affected by it, women and former alcoholics. Now, women were not generally supposed to get involved in politics at this time, but many made an exception for temperance because the issue felt so personal to them. As the movement grew in the 1820s and 30s, women were often more involved than their male countrymen. In Concord, Massachusetts, for example, women made up about 60% of their local temperance society. On the other side, in 1840, a group of former alcoholics formed the Washington Temperance Society. These guys had turned their own lives around by breaking their dependence on alcohol, and they were eager to help other people through the same process. Today, we have groups like Alcoholics Anonymous to fill this role, but in the 19th century, it was filled by the Temperance Movement. Having said that, though, we do also need to touch quickly on a negative side of the temperance movement. Much of the push to eliminate alcohol was tied to Protestant revivalism. The Catholic Church was not as quick to support this cause. When you combine that with the nativism that we talked about back in chapter 10, you wind up with some harmful stereotypes about Irish and German people being these degenerate alcoholic barbarians. Your textbook shows this image when it's talking about nativism, and the main point here is, ooh, scary foreigners are going to steal the ballot box. But there's a reason why the scary foreigners are specifically depicted as a whiskey barrel and a beer barrel, and it's tied to the temperance movement. Speaking of areas where society was making progress but mixing it with some shady nonsense, let's talk about science and medicine. So during this time, and really for most of human history, disease outbreaks were an ever-present part of life. This actually got worse as more and more people crowded into the cities. For example, the textbook cites a cholera outbreak in New Orleans in 1833 that killed about a quarter of the city's population. Some cities started forming local health boards during this period, but they were not super effective. You see, people didn't really understand how diseases actually spread. The prevailing theory was that it had to do with bad air in places like cemeteries and crowded slums, but the concept of germs wasn't really a thing yet. By the end of this period, though, science had started to take steps towards figuring that out. In the 1840s, an American named Oliver Wendell Holmes and a Hungarian named Ignaz Semmelweis independently studied infections in women who had just given birth, and they both came to the conclusion that the disease was actually being spread by the doctors on their unwashed hands and medical tools. Then, in the 1850s, an English doctor named John Snow basically invented modern epidemiology to track the source of the cholera outbreak in London. Extra History has a series on this topic, which I'll link to down below. Now, it takes time for new discoveries to spread throughout the scientific community, so these things didn't lead to an immediate total revolution in medicine during this period. However, they laid the groundwork for massive improvements in both medicine and public health later in the 19th century and into the 20th. But no discussion of 19th century medicine and science is complete without getting into some of the really off-the-wall ideas that people had at this time. At the end of the last episode, I promised you a tangent about graham crackers. Since I said that, Knowing Better actually put out an hour-long video that covers this in excruciating detail, link in the description, but here's the short version. During the 19th century, some Americans were becoming vegetarians. At a high level, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. You can do it for moral reasons or health reasons. But in the 19th century, there was also another reason that some people opposed eating meat. And I promise you, I'm not making this up. Some reformers believed that eating meat made people entirely too horny for their own good. They saw it as one of the biggest threats facing society. Your textbook mentions a reformer named Sylvester Graham, who, quote, accompanied his dietary prescriptions with moral warnings about the evils of excess and luxury, end quote. But it doesn't tell you that one of the specific excesses he was very concerned about was masturbation. From his lecture to young men on chastity, quote, by far the worst form of venereal indulgence is self-pollution, or what is called onanism. This exceedingly pernicious practice, I say, is incomparably the worst form of venereal indulgence. I have known boys to leave some of these institutions at the age of 12 and 13 almost entirely ruined in health and constitution by it. And they have assured me that to their certain knowledge, almost every boy in the school practiced the filthy vice. And many of them went to the still more loathsome and criminal extent of an unnatural commerce with each other. Despite being the type of person who would question essentially middle schoolers about their friends' masturbation habits, and literally believing that masturbation caused blindness, which I can only assume he learned from talking to those middle schoolers, Sylvester Graham was somehow actually very popular. So much so that when people decided to make a special whole grain cracker as a part of their vegetarian diet, they named it after him. So the next time that you're eating s'mores, consider the fact that the graham crackers you're eating were originally intended as a means of combating meat-based society-ending lust. And given the fact that society hasn't collapsed in the last 150 years, I mean, maybe. The last topic for today kind of blurs the line between science and social reform. You see, traditionally, American society didn't really have a plan for handling mental illness. People with any sort of psychological issue who weren't being taken care of by their family tended to wind up on the street or in prison. Reformers like Dorothea Dix pushed the states to establish mental asylums where people could go to receive humane treatment for their disorders. In practice, though, the care in these asylums was pretty poor, and they wound up being little more than a place to stick sick people so that the rest of society could ignore them more easily. A similar thing happened with prisons. Reformers favored the idea of penitentiaries, a place where a criminal could go to do penance in a very Christian sense, and redeem himself from his past mistakes. Again, this sounds nice at some level, but the specifics of how people were supposed to do penance were pretty grim. Rigid prison discipline often included things like solitary confinement, which is more likely to drive a person insane than it is to make them a productive member of society. Like the asylums, penitentiaries basically just became warehouses for society's undesirable population. But it wasn't all bad in terms of criminal justice reform. This period saw an end to the practice of putting people in prison for failing to pay their debts, and society was gradually moving away from public hangings. All in all, progress was being made. It just wasn't a straight line from bad to good. Like all human beings, the scientists and doctors and reformers of the 19th century made mistakes. But because people were committed to working on these problems over the course of years and decades, eventually some of the better ideas did float to the top, and progress did happen. And really, I think that's the story of the early 1800s. They saw a bunch of issues with society, and they tried a bunch of things to fix them. For better, and for worse, those attempted solutions set the stage for the rest of the century, and honestly, American history all the way up to the present. So yeah, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Join us next time for episode 12 part 2, Abolitionism and Feminism, in which William Lloyd Garrison writes a strongly worded letter to the CEO of racism. Let's hope that works out for him.